The following is a production of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. Made possible by the support of the Cyber Conflict Studies Association. Bringing citizens and citizen soldiers together through the exploration of military history, topics, and current affairs. This is Pritzker Military Presents.
Welcome to Pritzker Military Presents with our special guest, Jason Healey. I'm your host, Ken Clark. This program is coming to you from the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in downtown Chicago and is sponsored by the Cyber Conflict Studies Association, which is dedicated to promoting and leading a diversified research agenda in the field of cyber conflict. Later on, we'll take questions from our studio audience and from those joining us online at pritzkermilitary.org. Jason Healey is Director of Cyber Statecraft Initiative of the Atlantic Council, focusing on international cooperation, competition, and conflict in cyberspace. He has been involved in cyber issues since the 1990s as a policy director at the White House, executive director at Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong and New York, vice chairman of the Information Sharing and Security Organization for the finance sector, and as a U.S. Air Force intelligence officer. He is a board member of the Cyber Conflict Studies Association, lecturer in cyber policy at Georgetown University, and author of dozens of published essays and papers. He is editor of the book A Fierce Domain, Cyber Conflict 1986 to 2012, The First History of Conflict in Cyberspace. Please join me in welcoming to the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, Jason Healey.
Thanks so much for being here. Really Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Cyber might seem like an odd topic to be talking about at a military history museum and library. When I go to many cyber conferences, you'll hear a lot of things and will disagree, and professionals in my field about a lot of things. But a few things seems to be constant. You'll hear a lot that, wow, everything in cyber is changing. It's always fast, fast, fast. If you turn your back for a couple of weeks, there'll be something new that you're not ready for. After all, cyber is this new thing. It's built on information technology. If you want to understand it, you need to look forward. There's no sense looking back. This is starting to even be codified within the military. The command brief of Army Cyber Command says, prior to 2008, the main problem was noise in the networks. That is, the main thing that people in uniform had to worry about was the little stuff. But that there wasn't anything serious going on until, frankly, they themselves started to get into the game. But as we'll hear, that's not true. That we actually have a military history of cyber conflict. True, it's not long, but it goes back a lot farther than 2008. Tonight we'll be talking about 8 different stories, different narratives that were important conflicts in the history of cyber conflict, going all the way back to 1986. Now in military history, of course, 1986 is nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. But there are important lessons. There is a heritage. And frankly, right now, I can tell you that the United States military is broadly ignoring both that heritage as well as those lessons. So I want to start in 1986. There was an astronomer, a professional astronomer, like staring at the skies all night, working on one of the U.S. national laboratories. It wasn't the one doing nuclear weapons. It was one of those that tended to do unclassified work. And he happened to know a little bit about information technology, so they immediately said, you're a geek, you're going to run our IT systems. And one day he was noticing an error in his computer systems, in the billing systems that would say how much a person used the computer network. That would all get reconciled so they could charge out that to each of the different departments. The error was for 75 cents. and my wife is watching online, and she would tell you that I would easily ignore a 75-cent error. But this guy, Cliff Stoll was his name, he knew enough about computers to say, well, computers should either be absolutely right every time or completely wrong. There's no reason why it should be 75 cents off. So he pulled, and he realized he had an intruder in his systems. Somebody had broken into his computer networks, and the reason he had a 75-cent billing error was that they were trying to cover his tracks, and they didn't do it quite enough. So to put it in military terms, he was walking the fence line at the perimeter, and he noticed that something wasn't quite right. So at first, he said, it's those crazy kids at Berkeley, which was right across town. These kids with their music and their hair always breaking into my systems. But as he pulled farther, he said, well, this is odd, because they're not coming in the times I would expect. They're coming in the times that happen to align with daytime in Europe, not daytime here. And they seem to be taking off European holidays, not U.S. holidays. And worse, they weren't just coming in through his system and then going on to military bases, national labs, the defense industrial base companies. But they were looking for information on Ronald Reagan's Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, if you remember, right? Lasers in space. And he said, oh my gosh, these aren't kids. This is espionage. These are spies that are trying to go through my system. And so he went to the FBI. He went to other places. And they said, oh, you silly astronomer, you can't spy through networks. And they didn't pay any attention. Except for one guy. He was a young man at the time, an Air Force special agent named Jim Christie. And Jim said, wow, that sounds kind of interesting. Let me see what I can do to help. And to his credit, the Air Force let him do that. But they only let him do it because, one, he was a junior guy, so you don't have to have your senior people do something like this. Also, they said, we're not going to let you investigate this as hunting down spies. We'll let you do it as if you're investigating a fraud. As if someone was just fraudulently taking computer time rather than actually looking for American military secrets. So over the course of weeks and months, they're able to trace it back to Hanover, Germany, where there were a few hackers. One, the most famous, was named Marcus Hess, that were trying to break in and steal America's military secrets, and they were selling it on. Fortunately, they were not able to get classified that we were able to ever find. But what they were able to steal, they sold on to the Soviet KGB. So here we've got this classic case of spy versus spy. Not military history, it's true, but a conflict nonetheless, where you had U.S. and the government folks on one side, actively back and forth, trying to stop these people that were in our networks, that were inside our fence line, if you will, and try to figure what could we do to kick them out. And every time we would try to find one way to kick him out, he would be trying to find a way, they would be trying to find a way against the defenses that we would block. Which to me is you have this very sense of conflict that is there. And so to me, this is very important, because in 1986 case, because prior to 1986, you didn't need to think of this necessarily as military history, or to think of it as cyber conflict to understand it. I came out of signals intelligence. And you could think about much of what had come before 1986 as signals intelligence, or as computer crime. People were going in and they were breaking into other systems prior to 1986. And you had computer security. You had computer worms and viruses that had come out before 1986. But that's what I love about 1986 in this case, was that for the first time you had these elements that came together of not just computers and espionage and crime and conflict all coming together in one way. that you didn't have doing those things prior to 1986. And so when you hear someone say, and I do all the time, there's no history there. Prior to 2008, it was all noise on the network. Just look forward, the technology is always changing. But think about this case from 1986, and to me this is one of the most important lessons. There is a history that we can learn from. So I went to the Air Force Academy, I'm an Air Force officer, so I'm sorry I'm going to keep using Air Force analogies. But you could take a fighter pilot from 1916, from any country, and put them together with a fighter pilot today. And, give them a couple of beers because they're a fighter pilot. But within a couple of minutes, they're going to be doing this, right? I was in the dogfight. He was on my 6, throw on my brakes, flew right by. Too close for missiles, got to switch to guns. With almost 100 years separating those two fighter pilots, with tremendous differences in technology, with missiles and guns with tremendous lethality over speeds that would have been unthinkable when you were flying wood and canvas, over ranges over hundreds of miles. Despite all of that technological change, fighting in the air has changed so little that they can still do this 100 years later. You could take Jim Christie or Cliff Stoll from 1986 and you could put him into a Chinese cyber espionage case today, or vice versa, and each side would completely understand. Give them an hour to understand the technology, but cyber conflict has changed so little in over 25 years that they can still understand one another. And unfortunately, we're not teaching that. We're not teaching this as heritage. The names Jim Christie are largely forgotten in the military. One of the early Air Force aces. Fortunately, he's still around. He's still in one of the defense organizations, the Defense Computer Crime Center. And there's a few people that know where you are, but it's unfortunately been forgotten. Because some of the other lessons aren't just about heritage, but the other lessons deal specifically with military strategies and doctrines today and gaping vulnerabilities in the Department of Defense and the United States. So there's 7 other stories that I'd like to talk about at differing lengths. So that was 1986. 2 years later, in 1998, we had what was really the first wake-up call, where we had a young computer science student that sees tremendous vulnerabilities on the internet. And he says, I know what I'll do. I'll write a clever piece of computer ninja code, and it's going to sneak its way around the internet, and it's going to exploit this vulnerability. So there had been a programming failure, and he would write a piece of software that would go and exploit that software failure. And then when it had gone enough around the internet, he would say, aha! Look at what my cyber ninja code was able to do. And he would be famous, and forever after, the internet would be secure because of the bravery of this young man. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. He did not actually test his computer code, and so instead of sneaking around Ninja Light, boom, within a couple hours, he took down 10% of the internet. Because instead of being a ninja, it turns out he was driving around in a Mack truck and knocking everything over because he didn't write his computer code very well. And of course, there wasn't anyone in 1988, and by the way, 10% of the internet was 6,000 machines. There were 60,000 machines total on the internet at that time. And of course, the people that were in charge of defending the internet, which was still run as an arm of the Department of Defense at that time, they mostly coordinated using the internet itself. So after it struck, they didn't have a great way, they didn't have an organization, they didn't have a great way to coordinate and say, how are we going to fix what happened? What can we do to stop this computer software from doing these evil things? So in 1998, just after that, the Department of Defense went and said, we are going to create this first organization, and they will be there to find these vulnerabilities in our software, to help fix those vulnerabilities, to patch them in the terms of the trade so that it can't happen again, and also to coordinate when things happen so that we don't have to do it ad hoc. And this was called the Computer Emergency Response Team, or CERT, and it was an innovation at that time. What made this particularly embarrassing for the Department of Defense at the time was that the young man's name was Robert Tappan Morris, and his dad was a senior computer security researcher at the NSA, at the National Security Agency. So it was particularly embarrassing for the Department of Defense. 10 years later, after the Morris worm, so in the intervening years we had Desert Storm and the Gulf War, which taught the Department of Defense and all the other militaries of the world what can happen when you have one military force that has a tremendous information advantage over another military force, right? It's not even a fair fight. This got the Pentagon, other militaries thinking about information operations and thinking how you could use information in different ways. 1998, there was an exercise that was run out of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon. The chairman would get briefed every morning, every evening on the course of the exercise that lasted a couple of weeks. And they took some NSA hackers, they're called a red team, someone that you would have try and break into your systems and see how well you would do. And they took these best of the best. They wouldn't make a Robert Tappan Morris mistake. They knew how to test their code. And they took them and they essentially turned them feral. They said, you can't take any classified cyber weapons with you. You can take just what's in your head and what you can download off of the internet and go off. They didn't have a very strict script. If you have any of you have done military exercises, sometimes they can be very scripted. At this time, the attacking force will do X. At this time, the attacking force will try and do Y. And that's the way we generally do cyber exercises today. That's not how this was run. They were generally sent off on their own. And they were able to prove that they could not just get into military networks. The exercise was against Pacific Command in Hawaii. But they were able to demonstrate getting into not just the unclassified networks, but also into the classified networks, SIPRNet, as we call it in the military today. They also demonstrated how they could bring down America's critical infrastructure, taking down power in one city or another. And so this particularly scared the United States government. This was briefed to the White House and others, and the Pentagon had to confess that if this were real, we're not sure we could really fight a war. They're in our classified military networks, which is how we make sure that men and material get to the right place. It's how we issue orders and get out things like the air tasking order so that the air forces know where they're supposed to be and where they're supposed to drop bombs. And right now, we're not sure we could trust any of that. So everybody is really worried about this. This is the end of 1997. Just a couple months after that, so everybody's worried now, right? You've done the exercise. You're scared. You're appropriately scared. From the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on down. A couple months later, February 1998, and the United States Air Force, which was ahead in this field, largely because of that 1986 case I talked about, they detect some relatively sophisticated intrusions coming in. So someone or someones are trying to break into Air Force networks and being relatively successful at it. So again, they're getting into the fence line. They're not just getting past the fence line. We know they're going into our buildings, as an analogy. And what's worse, some of these attacks trace back to the Middle East. And in fact, some trace back specifically to one of the very few internet network gateways into Saddam Hussein's Iraq. So if you were going to try and hack from Iraq, this was one of the very few paths that you could take to reach the United States. This was right during Desert Fox. Saddam Hussein was threatening to kick out the UN nuclear inspectors. If you remember, back in 1998, there was this back and forth, Saddam saying he's going to kick out nuclear inspectors. We would gear up military force So in this time, February 1998, we've sent in an additional aircraft carrier to the region, into the region, sending in additional F-16s in case we need to bomb him to convince him not to kick out the nuclear inspectors. Well, so having just been scared by this exercise, you can imagine the mood in the Pentagon. Cyber war, it's on, baby. This is it. The Deputy Secretary of Defense even briefed the president and said this might be a digital Pearl Harbor. Turns out it wasn't. It was 2 California teenagers, underage, so we never actually found out their real names, with an Israeli mentor. But it scared the Department of Defense, because they looked around and they said, who's in charge? We can't let this computer emergency response team we created 10 years ago be in charge. They're civilians. So we need something different. And so that led them in 1998 to stand up this first cyber command. They said, we have to have a general in charge. That general was Soup Campbell. He was a 2-star F-15 pilot, and he was my boss. So I helped set up that unit, and I was one of the first 25 people. Now that unit's gone on to become United States Cyber Command, with many, many thousands of people there. And frankly, they don't even recognize that first unit in 1998 as part of their heritage of what they set up together. 1998 was a seminal year. You had this big exercise in 97, you had the scare in 1998, you set up this first joint cyber command in 1998 with the Joint Task Force Computer Network Defense. So it was this big inflection point where you saw a lot turn. Just in time for another one of the big wake-up calls, which it had the code name of Moonlight Maze, which was a sophisticated espionage case. And here it seemed to trace back not to Germany or California, but here it seemed to trace back directly to Moscow. Especially we've been able to find open source, the Russian Academy of Sciences, where it looks like they were trying to break in and steal as much science and technology information as they could possibly steal, leaving volumes and volumes at a time. And we never were able to finally close out the case, at least that I can find in the unclassified. And this is one of the things that's difficult about being a historian of cyber issues. So much remains classified. We have to try and piece together the story as well as we can. The same thing with Chinese espionage. Around 2003, it no longer seemed like Russian espionage was the major conflict that we were dealing with, but Chinese espionage. At least what we can see in unclassified, it was starting as early as 2003. Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, actually went in 2007 to the Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao to say something along the lines of, stay out of my laptop. It took 2013, 6 years later, before President Obama would finally say the same thing to his Chinese counterpart. 6 years where the United States might have gone to China to say, we're tired of seeing the blueprints for the F-35 leave our networks. We're tired of seeing you break into everything from our military companies to the U.S. Olympic Committee so that you can steal information as you get ready for the Beijing Olympics. I mean, the Chinese were so bad, they were even going into the Anti-Doping Association prior to the Beijing Olympics so they could find out more information that might let them know more about what was happening as they were getting ready for the Beijing Games in 2008. When the United States intelligence community breaks into a place using cyber, they tend to be very quiet, a lot of what we called in the Cold War tradecraft. When the Chinese would do it, I've heard from colleagues that they would see 6 different Chinese hacker groups in one company at the same time, all stealing different kinds of information and not coordinating with one another. So that's all secretive stuff, right? That's been a lot of spy versus spy conflict, but not necessarily military history. That lasts up until 2007, when Estonia decided that they were going to move a bronze soldier that represented a soldier from the Red Army. Now, you know the Soviet Army, when they liberated places across Europe, they would put up one of these soldiers in a very heroic pose. Now, I'm told that the Russians feel the same way about that as we feel about military cemeteries. You know, if anyone desecrated a U.S. cemetery in Normandy, we would be berserk with rage. And I'm told the Russians feel the same way about these statues. So the Estonians saying they were going to move it out from a traffic circle where it attracted Russian nationalist demonstrations which blocked traffic to a military cemetery, to us that doesn't sound bad. Apparently to the Russians it was very inflammatory. And so in the capital of Estonia, they saw not only physical protests, but a wave of cyber attacks that took the country down on and off for weeks. And so this was a real wake-up call in Washington, D.C. and Brussels, especially at NATO headquarters. Because this was the first clear case we saw of one country saying they are going to use cyber as a means to coerce another country. That rather than bring up forces on their border to try and convince them, they're going to use this cyber power to disrupt financial transactions, to disrupt government services, to disrupt everything they can. And in the end, the attacks were so much that Estonia basically had to take themselves offline to try and stop the attacks, so they could at least communicate among themselves. The following year, when Russia invaded Georgia, 2008, Putin wasn't happy just allowing and encouraging cyber attacks to happen. Against Georgia, he went further to encourage, coordinate, even shape the attacks so that he could make sure that the prime minister's website was down, that Georgian government email was down, so they could not communicate via email to help get out their word about what was happening or try and coordinate defenses using email. And it was much more coordinated with an actual physical ground assault and aerial assault. The first time we've ever seen that. I'll jump forward a couple of years. What we're seeing now between Russia and Ukraine is somewhat similar, with not only cyber attacks, but also fit in with traditional Russian military doctrine from Cold War days of Maskirovka, of deception, of propaganda, of using all sorts of information, not just cyber attacks, to try and fit in with what they want to do. If you have other questions on Ukraine, we can talk about that. The two last cases I want to talk about before we get to the lessons. Because the next one should not have been a surprise to the Department of Defense. Because it's the same lesson they could have learned in 1988 and they could have learned in 1998. And so for those of you in uniform, you might know the name Operation Buckshot Yankee. If you don't know the name, this is the thumb drive attack. That makes it very difficult for anyone in uniform or anyone in the military to use any thumb drives. You know, these small, removable hard drives that will carry memory around for you. Because what happened was a foreign intelligence power, looks like it was Russia, flooded Afghanistan with these cheap thumb drives, knowing that they would be bought by GIs and brought back and put into their computers. It had relatively unsophisticated software on it that once it was in a computer would start to spread around and report back to its masters. After a while of spreading around, it made the jump. Some unfortunate soldier, sailor, airman, marine, civilian took it from the unclassified network, where not much important happens, and somehow plugged it into the classified network. So now it was spreading around the classified network, SIPRNet, where the military operates, where it shares intelligence, where it sends its plans around of how they're planning to fight today's war and tomorrow's war. And this was in Afghanistan. So this was affecting U.S. Central Command. But the Pentagon had the same exact moment they had, this was around 2009, the same moment they had 10 years earlier, the same moment they had 20 years earlier, of saying, oh my gosh, what's happening? Who's in charge? How do we coordinate? Who do we look to get ourselves out of the situation? And they found they still didn't have the right organization. And so it was this attack, Buckshot Yankee, that led directly to now the United States Cyber Command. Basically that same aha moment. And I've talked to generals involved in all three of these cases, where they say, oh my gosh, what just happened? We need someone in charge. We need someone higher rank in charge with more ability to order people around so that we can know what's happening and get ourselves out of this. Same moment 3 times. And I'm sure we're going to have to learn this case again and again. The last of the cases I'll talk about, in the White House, in the intelligence and military circles, it was known as Olympic Games. We knew it first as the name it hit the newspapers in Stuxnet. Stuxnet was a highly, highly classified program, apparently by the United States and Israel, the CIA and NSA on our side, to disrupt the uranium enrichment program of Iran. So it was a very incredibly sophisticated piece of software that had to be smuggled in at great personal risk to the Iranian computer networks. And it was so sophisticated it would spread around, and it was only try to spread to computers that were running centrifuges. So these very sophisticated pieces of gear that would spin around and around to purify uranium so that it could be used in a nuclear reactor or, more dangerously, a bomb. And so this covert actions program snuck its way in to these centrifuges. And once it was inside one of those networks, and it knew, absolutely knew. We've dealt with simple programs that might know, yes, I'll give you email. Or yes, I'll bet, I know that you're inside the loop and you're looking for a steak restaurant. This software was millions and millions of dollars so that it would know that I'm in the right place. This computer is controlling these centrifuges that spin at thousands of RPMs. And then it would say, go to 0 RPMs. Go to 20,000 RPMs. And back and forth and back and forth. And poof! And they'd popped. And they actually went into President Obama and say, look what we can do. Well, Bush and Obama. Look what we can do. We can physically destroy these. Never happened before that you had an attack like this that could physically break stuff. And so President Bush and then President Obama said, yep, let's do it. Keep going. If we can delay their program, it's worth it. But it did a couple of things. First, our American policy had always been, we want to protect American computers. And now we've been authorizing this program to going after someone else's computers, and we got caught doing it. Also, it was a first because the computer attacks before this one, if they got into your system and disrupted it, it only disrupted things made of ones and zeros. It only broke stuff made of silicon. If it destroyed something, at worst you have to put in a new hard drive or you have to type your paper again. It's generally very easy to take things down with cyber weapons. It's very difficult to keep them down over time. Just like in fighting in air, land, and sea, right? I mean, we learned the hard way in 1941 that you can bomb someone's airfield or their factory, but they're going to rebuild it. You have to keep going and restrike it. And the same thing had been true in cyber. It's easy to take down a web page or something else, but it's hard to keep it down because they'll rebuild it. Stuxnet was the first time we really saw physical destruction. Something that you can't just reload the software for. It was hard broken. And that was really scary to us. Because if we could do it to Iranian centrifuges, someone else might be able to do it to our power generators, to our dams, to the stuff that we really care about. As far as I can tell in my history, no one yet has died from a cyber attack. But once we go from things that don't just break ones and zeros to things that break steel and concrete, that puts us in a very dangerous place indeed. So, my main lessons out of this, I've already talked about them. There is a history, it has lessons, and we're largely ignoring them. 2, related to the point I've just made. It's easy to keep things down with cyber. It has been difficult to keep them down over time. That means we've tended to grossly overestimate the damage that can get done by a cyber attack. We've been talking about a digital Pearl Harbor since 1991. Over 20 of the over 70 years since the actual Pearl Harbor. So obviously there's something different going on that we're not paying attention to. The last of the lessons, and one that I've hinted at, is that the more strategically significant the cyber conflict, the more similar it is to conflict in the air, land, and sea. And I'll say that again, because it's not what you hear in the Pentagon or in U.S. Cyber Command. The more strategically significant the cyber conflict, the more similar it is to everything else that you hear here at the Pritzker Military Library. Right? That when you when you hear people talk about cyber, they'll tell how it's so fast, how you can bring something down like that, how it's difficult to warn, that you can't really know who's responsible. And I hear that again and again, even from 4-star generals that do cyber. You can't deter the other person because you can't know who the other person is on the other side of the keyboard. If you ever hear someone say that, they're here in the foxholes. That 4-star general is talking about tactical engagements. What we learned when we look at this, not as a series of tactical engagements doing this spooky ones and zero thing, but what we learn when we look at it as military history is that it's not this spooky things of ones and zeros that happens at the speed of light and you can't know who did it. There are conflicts that tend to take place between existing national rivals, the United States and China, Russia and the United States, Israel and Iran, India and Pakistan, Israel and Palestinian supporters, during a time of spiking geopolitical tensions, and that makes them very easy to warn about, because you don't have to predict an evil cyber attack. You can predict what another government is likely to do. They're not over at the speed of light. They tend to take place over weeks, months, and years, just like what I talked about with what Jim Christie was doing with Cliff Stoll. You block them, they come back and do something else. You find another way to block them. Just like we're used to, just like we learned in normal military history. You've got this back and forth. And we know that deterrence seems like it's working. Because we know countries have had the opportunity to attack one another using this for a long time, and we've tended not to. The attacks that we've had have been spying. The attacks have been low-level things to, like, take down websites. We haven't seen Russia or the United States go after one another with truly dangerous capabilities, even though we know each side has them. So that's restraint. We're seeing restraint among the big powers and how they use this. Now, if we were talking about nuclear weapons or traditional weapons, we would call that restraint deterrence. So, the lessons I want to talk about. There is a history. We need to learn. When I was doing the research for this book, I found military folks strangely incurious about the history. And if you don't know the history, it's difficult to know what might come next. I found the military strangely incurious about the people that had come before. There's a colonel, Dusty Rhodes, that set up the first military combat unit doing offense and defensive cyber missions in 1995. Nobody in the Air Force knows his name. I was the only researcher that came to talk to that guy. He's probably in his 60s now, late 50s, and I'm the only person that's go and talk to him. So we need to do better to learn this heritage. Because if you know your heritage, if you know where you came from, you're better off knowing where you're going. And the last two lessons, to summarize, that we've always tend to overestimate the impact of disruptive cyber attacks. So far, we haven't seen a digital Pearl Harbor, but we might the more we start putting real things online, things made of concrete and steel. And that most of these conflicts that we've talked about, they're not a spooky cyber thing that you leave to the specialists. The really important cyber conflicts, the strategic ones, you can use the way that you normally think of national security, the way that we normally train folks at military staff schools, at National Defense University, at the military academies. That normal stuff that we teach can help people a lot farther in this strange cyber thing than they've been told in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you for making the chapter on the Olympic Games Stuxnet understandable for the non-techno geek.
Yeah.
Two quick questions. One, given the probable prevalence of trapdoors and critical points of our critical infrastructure, what would you advise the people that are pushing smart grid interconnectivity? Yeah. And the second question, since each of the armed services in the U.S. military have their own cyber command, what advice would you give on improving their interrelationships to reduce redundancy and turf battles and their relationship with the NSA?
Mm-hmm. The first one is certainly a lot easier. So people that might not know, you can certainly see the trend. We've gone from a couple years ago when we didn't use the internet for anything important to now increasingly it's become important in all of our lives. And even if you don't think it's important in your lives, it's starting to become ever more so. So the question was about smart grid, which is how can we be more efficient? How can we be more environmentally friendly by taking our electrical grid and starting to put elements of our electrical grid online? And as I mentioned in the Stuxnet attack, we know such things are vulnerable to attack. It's happened, we've demonstrated it, we've even been the first one to pull the trigger. So when you talk to the people in our business, I think smart grid and the Internet of Everything, where increasingly we want to have everything to be connected to the Internet, that is what the technical term is scares the bejesus out of us. That's when we go from the disruptions being short and relatively easy to bounce back from to the kinds of places where people can attack us here in the United States and have a real impact. So our recommendations are to continue to try to go more slowly with that. Just because we can do it doesn't mean we have to rush to do it. Let's try and get security first, put the security in place first. We're not going to do it. We're going to rush it out just like we've done everything else that's connected to the internet, and then afterwards figure out how to plug those gaps. But it's a good question. Continue to bring it up when you can. We need to call attention to that. We are seeing some redundancies between the different cyber commands. So we have a U.S. cyber command. It reports to strategic command. And then underneath that, there is every service has set up their own cyber command. So 24th Air Force, 2nd Division, 10th Fleet of the different services. And those are large organizational units, right? I mean, a 24th Air Force has subordinate wings and groups and squadrons. It's the largest unit of organization in the Air Force itself for doing operational missions. So where I think the military needs to go is as you say, there's a lot of redundancy. So, for example, we don't necessarily, what's the difference between an Air Force mission and a Navy mission? We're still all going over the internet. We're still protecting our computers from attacks over the internet. So all of that is common. All of that could be considered a joint mission that we could reorganize for. That's not a new idea. I'm sure at Cyber Command, Defense Information Systems Agency, they would love to bring some of that in. So that way the military forces can specialize in things that they're good at. So that the Air Force can specialize in air defense, the Navy can specialize in coastal defenses and trying to break into other guys' ships. So we're starting to get down that way. But we don't necessarily know if the future battlefield is mostly going to be about the military or is mostly going to be fought in the civilian private sector, where it has been in the past. So to me, actually figuring out that those DoD efficiencies and ways to get better might not actually help defend the Department of Defense or the United States. Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering if you could comment on the Israeli experience in 2007 when they attacked the Syrian reactor. The rumor was that they supposedly hacked the Syrian integrated air defense system. And then if you could shed any additional open source information on the Air Force supercomputer program.
I'm sorry, I don't know much about the Air Force supercomputer program. I'm sorry? Okay, no, nope. Sorry, no, there's probably a better way of doing that. So, Ken will tell me how I should have done that. So 2007 Syria, it's interesting. In the book, I only briefly touch on it. So the case was, supposedly the North Koreans had sold the makings of nuclear power plant to Syria, which they were building in the middle of the Syrian desert. The Israelis came to the United States and say, if you don't do something about this, we will. We said, no thanks, we're bombing enough sandy countries at the moment, we don't think we should do another one. So the Israelis authorized an operation to go in and take it out. The planes were strangely undisturbed, even for the Israeli Air Force, as they went in and took it out. Afterwards, we had a number of stories that came to say they weren't just using electronic warfare to jam the signals, but perhaps they might have hacked in or been able to tamper with the equipment even before it arrived in Syria, so that the planes would not even show up on the radar. I only touched on it because you can't find any more information than that. You have these rumors, you have these this, that, and the other about it, and there wasn't a lot for me as a researcher to get my teeth into to try and figure out if this was really just electronic attack, radar jamming like we've done since World War II, or if there was really something here. Because if there was really something here, usually militaries try to keep this as an incredible secret. You don't just roll these capabilities out for a single strike. You want to use them so that time you really have to. So I'm not sure, even if the Israeli Air Force has the capability, and I'm sure they've been trying, it wouldn't surprise me at all to find out they have the capability. But is this the time you want to use it? Or do you want to save it for when you're really at war with the Syrians? Because once you use it, the Syrians know. You know that equipment is going to have Russian technicians all over it trying to figure out what happened. So you only use it if you've got a lot of other arrows in your quiver. And this is one of the differences between cyber weapons and normal weapons. We can use a JDAM. We can drop bombs on folks, and they know what's coming. They know it's a bomb. They know exactly what it's going to do. But that doesn't necessarily help them defend that much better the next time. You use a cyber capability against Syrian air defense, they're going to be able to look at it and say, aha, they got in this way. It's almost better to think of it like that perimeter, like of your military base, right? They got in this way. There was a culvert we didn't know about. They crawled through the culvert. We'll patch that up so they can't get through. Now you got to find some other way in. So I'm very mixed about whether that was actually a true cyber capability or not. I wish I did.
So there's a lot of chatter going around on the internet that the NSA has compromised a lot of the new cryptography standards. Do you think the NSA would in fact have done that? And do you think that would be dangerous not only for enemies of the United States, but possibly for the United States itself?
Yes. I don't know if they have. So the current news is that NSA, which is in charge of protecting our codes and breaking the codes of the other guys, they've been very, very deep in this business since the time I was there, mid-'90s. And the current news is that they've gone into some of the codes that we most use today, that we base a lot of our existence on, and they might have gone in and put in backdoors. A backdoor so obscure that they would be the only ones that could discover it. Yes, of course they're doing that. I don't know if they did in the case that came up here, but there's been enough other cases where we know that they've asked for backdoor access to this, that, or the other system. Modern codes are so tough they are virtually unbreakable even to the NSA. They could break them, but they could only break them if they had weeks or months to try it. So, of course, if you're in that situation, you want to try to find ways around that if you can. So, no, I mean, I would certainly expect that they're off trying to do that. I'm very worried about that. If you remember, I said earlier, I talked about a red team. A red team is a friendlies that you're paying to try and break into your system to figure out if you're secure. You're paying someone to break into your military base to see if they're able to get in, as an analogy. One of my favorite quotes from the book was, "Few, if any, security controls can stop a dedicated red team from easily accessing any information sought." Meaning that if someone's trying to break into your systems, they're going to be able to do it. And that quote was from 1979. So for 35 years, we've known the bad guys have had the advantage. 35 years. It's been easier for the bad guys to break in. So my goal is to flip that around, to get defense better than offense. We know it happens all the time in military, right? I mean, offense was dominant until it ran into mass rifle fire, objectified by the machine gun. Then defense was dominant until years later you had a combination of technologies, radio, armor, and aircraft, with the doctrine to bring them all together. So I'm hopeful that we can get defense better than offense. And I think you can only get there if we make defense a priority. And I don't think you can do defense as a priority if NSA is doing all of the stuff that we're seeing these headlines that they're doing. It's very difficult to get to that place. So I think it's a very short-sighted national security. We're getting great intelligence that's helping keep America safe. I have no doubt about that for what NSA is doing. But I think it's short-sighted. And I think the limited amount of protection we're getting now is going to come at much greater cost in later years. Thanks for the question. Sir?
Could you be so kind and talk a bit about industrial espionage? How safe are Grumman, Raytheon, Boeing, and others?
A lot safer now than they had been. These cases, from the earliest cases here, 1986, we saw those companies getting broken into. It really started to matter to the Department of Defense when Lockheed Martin got broken into. It looks like it was the Chinese, and at least from what we see in the newspapers, they took the plans for the F-35, the trillion-dollar aircraft, the bedrock of Western modern air forces. They took the plans. The thing that we're spending so much money to keep secret. So that was an absolute shock to the system. So now it's gotten significantly better. You're seeing a lot more sharing. One of the smartest things that a department did was it told those companies you can share information amongst one another. You won't get in trouble if Booz Allen shares with General Dynamics, shares with Lockheed Martin, shares with BAE. Go ahead and do that. No antitrust problems. They've also been doing better at sharing classified information with them. That's been a so-so. But now you're getting into this place where the department's trying to tell those companies, if you get hacked into, you have to tell us. That's been kind of controversial when it seems like it should be obvious. And so there's still a ways to go yet before we can get there.
Just a real quick question. Where does artificial intelligence fit into any of this?
Interesting. It's a great question. I couldn't have planted a better question. Where you can really see this, on defense, we've been trying to have autonomic systems for 15 years. You know, the part of your body that runs the heartbeat and the breathing, you don't have to think about that. It happens like that. So on defense, we've been trying to do that with mixed results. But what really worries me is Stuxnet. Because remember what Stuxnet did? It snuck in to the system for weeks or months at a time. And when it saw those Iranian nuclear equipment, it didn't say, am I in the right place? This is what I see in my sight picture. This is what's in my crosshairs. Am I authorized to shoot? It didn't do that. It didn't have time. It was a closed network, and our spies and the Israeli spies knew that we might never be able to talk to this again, or only with difficulty. As soon as it was in those systems and it knew it was in the right spot, with 100%, it started smashing those systems. Now, we've had systems that have been autonomous before, like the Sea-Wiz system that protects ships, or anti-radiation missiles. You can set up, and if you see a radar in these parameters, go ahead and blow it up. But those are only a couple hours at best at a time, and only in a real active theater of war. So to me, Stuxnet, for the first time since humans first picked up stick and stone against one another, this was a truly new form of warfare, a new kind of weapon that we just launch. Truly fire and forget for months at a time. So if that's going to be the dominant form of warfare 10 years from now, one, the Department of Defense isn't talking much about if that's the dominant form of warfare. But the only defense against that is then to have automated defenses. And now you've got automated attacks going against automated defenses, all happening faster than we can respond to. To me, it's like high frequency trading, where you've got these systems that are operating faster than we can. Now, I'm in Chicago. I know we probably have a lot of HFT guys around here, so I'm not going to extend that analogy. All right, and I might not get dinner bought for me.
You've tied a lot of parallels to physical security and cybersecurity. Is there any intrinsic difference between cybersecurity and physical security? And if so, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, there are. When I said there's some of this real technical stuff. I've been doing that as an analogy to make it, to make it more real for the audience. It is tactically, it's far, far faster. One of my colleagues says, if someone robs a bank in your town, the amount of people that you have to look at are the people that live in that town or could reasonably drive in and out. I mean, it's a limited population. If someone does a bank heist online, then your list of possible perpetrators is everybody that's got a network connection. I mean, it's far more difficult. So there are some important differences. To me, the most important difference is the role of the private sector. And I've had 4 stars say, I get it, Jay. I know that when I'm fighting in cyberspace, I'll be out in the middle of an ocean, and normally I don't have civilian ships floating through the middle of my battle space. I get that in cyber, that I get that the civilian ships are sailing through. And actually, that's wrong. That's not the right analogy. Because when you're fighting in cyberspace, the civilian ships aren't floating through your battle space. You're fighting in an ocean that the private sector built for their own purposes with their own money. And when we're off cyber warfighting, we're navigating through AT&T and Verizon and these other places. And so it's very private sector dominant in ways that we don't see in the air, land, and sea. And I think, now you're asking about security, which is much more on the tactical side. Certainly, and this is the mistake that I see from the 4 stars on down, that the most fundamental difference for the Pentagon, for the military, for fighting, is that role of the private sector. Thank you.
Have the Russians penetrated the White House secret security systems in the last few years? Because it seems like Putin seems to know what's going on at the White House.
Yeah. One of my colleagues at the Cyber Conflict Studies Association, Bob Gorley, he'll always say, the United States doesn't need a cyber czar. We already have a cyber czar. It's Putin, and but from what I've been able to see, only the unclassified systems. I haven't come across anything, classified or unclassified, that says that folks have been able to get into the classified White House systems. So, it's the limits of the researcher is trying to work with what we've got. From what I've seen about other military systems, we know they've gotten into CyberNet, the secret internet that the military uses. And that's strongly defended, but it's not that strongly defended. There are probably hundreds of thousands of people that have access to CyberNet. White House is at least a little bit smaller, easier to detect, easier to monitor. So even if they did get in, I'm not sure they'd be able to stay for very long. I hope. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to Jason Healey for joining us, and to the Cyber Conflict Studies Association for sponsoring this program. The book is A Fierce Domain, Cyber Conflict, 1986 to 2012. To learn more about the Cyber Conflict Studies Association and the book A Fierce Domain, visit cyberconflict.org. To learn more about the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, download audio podcasts, view additional content, become a member, and explore all that the museum and library has to offer, visit us in person or online at pritzkermilitary.org. Thanks for watching, and please join us next time on Pritzker Military Presents.
Pritzker Military Presents is made possible by members of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library and its sponsors. The views and opinions expressed in this program are not necessarily those of the museum and library. If you would like to be a part of our studio audience, become a member, or learn more, visit pritzkermilitary.org. The preceding program was produced by the Pritzker Military Museum and Library.